Well, thank you for joining me on this journey today. My name is Casey Sabella, and I'm 68 years old, and I'd like to share with you my conversion to Jesus Christ over 50 years ago and what he's done in my life since then. To get a context of what that means, I grew up in the last century. I was born in 1955. I grew up during the 1960s. And especially for those of you who are quite a bit younger than me, let me just spend a moment or two sharing about the culture of that day. When I grew up among 5 brothers and 1 sister. I was the middle child. My father had grown up in poverty in New York City and had fought his way up to become an executive. And so we were living in a pretty nice house in a pretty nice neighborhood, but there was great turmoil in our family. When I was in the 3rd grade, I remember my teacher coming into the room, bursting into tears because President Kennedy had just been shot. And we watched on television everything surrounding that particular tragedy. When I was a teenager, Martin Luther King was shot, as also Bobby Kennedy, John Kennedy's brother, was shot. There was great turmoil within the culture at that time, and it was all somewhat connected to a revolution that was happening in music and culture. The Beatles came on our shore during those early 60s. Guys went from having crew cuts to having what they thought of as long hair. And my hair was about as long as the Beatles were when they first came here, but people were appalled by this sort of thing. They also introduced a culture of drugs into our way of thinking. No one had ever heard of LSD or any of these other drugs really until the 60s. And the Beatles sort of led the way, as well as other groups like the Rolling Stones. And again, they were around too. But the experimentation of drugs became very much a part of young people's mindset. The concept back then was to check out of the culture, and fashion changed dramatically. There was war going on in Vietnam. Men were dying. Young men were dying in Vietnam in a war that no one could explain exactly even why we were there. So our culture was in upheaval, and I was growing up in that era. When you think about technology, what we become used to in our society was definitely absent from when I was growing up. If you wanted to use the phone, there was a phone in the kitchen attached to the wall with a cord. And if you called somebody and they had a busy signal, well, then you had to wait. There wasn't anything that was going to interrupt that call. And we didn't depend on the phone back then as much as we do today. Phones didn't take pictures. If you wanted to take a picture, you had to purchase film, the equivalent of about $10 to $12 in a drugstore. You purchased the film, you could take about 24 pictures. After that, you took the film out, you put it in a package, sent it off with another $10 or $15, the equivalent of that, to a place that would develop the film. And then about 2 weeks later, you get all the film, you get the pictures back, most of which were usually blurry or, not exactly what you had thought they would be. And probably 5 out of the 24 would be acceptable, in which you put them into photo albums. But a different kind of mindset, because we didn't relate to each other based on technology at all. Back then, it was really strictly face-to-face. And so the idea of Facebook and the things that we've become used to today were really absent from what we were used to. That gives you somewhat of an idea of the environment that I grew up in. When I was in my early teenage years, Eastern philosophy became a big deal. And it's unfortunately become a big deal again in our society. But a lot of the young people and people my age were rejecting Christianity and traditional religions, and they were embracing yoga, the occult, Hinduism, Buddhism. And again, combined with music, people were using their music to express these thoughts and ideas. As I mentioned earlier, the Beatles were a big deal when I was growing up, and everybody, especially every boy, learned how to play the guitar. And we didn't do it because we loved music. We did it because we saw how the Beatles were getting all the girls. So everyone who was interested in having a girlfriend learned how to play the guitar, because that would open up an opportunity for you to meet girls. So At 12 years old, I was learning to play the guitar like boys my age and became relatively good at it. I would go down to the local park, which was also very common, and just play music. People would sit around the circle, play music, oftentimes smoke marijuana, do that kind of dynamic, and that was sort of the normal thing among young people. At that time, I was someone who looked a lot older than I was. At 12 years old, I was sporting a mustache almost, because facial hair came in very young for me. So I tended to look quite a bit older than I was, and as a result, I hung around people that were older than me. So people who were 15, 16, 17 saw me as one of their peers. I got involved even at 14 years old with Eastern philosophy, yoga, began to practice Kung Fu karate, and joined a studio back then to learn how to connect with Buddhism, Hinduism, Eastern cult philosophies, and different things like that. And I became enmeshed in that whole culture. Meanwhile, at home, my relationship with my parents was absolutely horrible. We fought all the time, especially my father and I. We did not get along, and there was just turmoil among all of the boys at that time in our house. I actually left home for a while and lived at the dojo where I practiced karate. I just wanted to be outside of the house. At 15 years old, I got myself a job, and I was living outside of the house because I couldn't stand my parents. I couldn't stand being around them. Around that time, my oldest brother, who was somebody part of the Woodstock generation, somebody who was an accomplished musician in his own right, but someone who was very involved with LSD and that kind of culture, called home. He was attending college out on the other side of the country. He called home to tell us that he'd become a Christian. Now, we grew up in a traditional Christian denomination. We grew up as Catholics. And so my parents said to him, well, you've always been a Christian. And he said, no, you don't understand. I've become a born-again Christian. I've given my life to Jesus Christ. My parents didn't really know what to make of it. And so they just kind of accepted it at face value. I thought my brother was out of his mind, to be honest with you. But a couple of months later, he invited me to come out and visit him at college. I had absolutely no intention of going. But my father said, listen, if you'll go, I'll pay the way. I'd never seen my father pay for anything, even though he was an up-and-coming executive. He never handed us money. And when he said he'd give me a free flight to the West Coast, I said, why not? So I went out there. While I was in the plane, I was looking down over Denver saying, what did I do? Where am I going? And I arrived on the other side of the country in a place called Portland, Oregon at the time. And I was met by people who called themselves Christians. They brought me to a park where they were playing music and sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. And quite frankly, I just said to myself, what am I doing? I'm among a bunch of Jesus freaks. And all they seem to talk about is God. I can only tell you that I wasn't really quite interested in what my brother was doing and Christianity in general. He invited me to go to a church at the time. And honestly, when I saw them lifting their hands and worshiping God and talking about Jesus, I just told my brother afterwards, I want nothing to do with this. This doesn't interest me in whatsoever. I was at the house. We lived together with a number of students who shared expenses, and so I was there for about a month with my brother, and somewhat bored, to be honest with you. And he invited me to come to church a couple of days later, and I just said, I'm not into this sort of thing. You do whatever you want to do. I'm going to do what I want to do. And I said, well, what about dinner? And they said, well, we're going to be having dinner down at the church tonight. I came to understand that if I was going to eat dinner, I would have to go to church to eat. So I said, okay, well, can I go to church and eat and then leave? And I said, sure. So I went down there, I had a meal, and then my brother said, why don't you just come to service? You got nothing else to do anyway. I said, okay. And I went to the church service, didn't understand a single word that preacher said that night. None of it made any sense to me. But at the end of that message, he said these words. He said, if there's a mountain in your life, God can move it. Now, I didn't have an image of a mountain in my life or anything like that, but those words really penetrated. And that night, in that service, I just said to the air, because I didn't believe in God at the time, I just said, if you're really there and you can reveal yourself to me in a way that I understand, I'll follow you. I can only tell you from my personal experience that my life dramatically changed in that moment. It wasn't a physical experience. I didn't have some kind of physical reaction, but I went from being essentially an agnostic person to being an atheist to knowing that Jesus Christ was really God. I mean, I knew it, and I didn't know how. Also, the hatred that I've been carrying in my life, not only for my parents, but for many other people, instantly gone. I mean, it was noticeable to me because I carried so much of that anxiety and hatred and just a lot of bad things that I don't have the time to describe today. But I carried all of that, and all of a sudden it was just gone. It had lifted. It amazed me at the time, and I didn't know really, honestly, what had happened. I just knew that something would change. My brother said that I'd become a Christian. I said, I don't think so. I'm not into what your guys are doing, but something has happened. I cracked open the Bible the next morning and began to read. I'd never read the Bible before because I always told people that it was full of contradictions. Well, I'd never read it before, but I always used to say that. Anyway, I started reading the New Testament, and I was amazed that it wasn't very religious. Jesus and the apostles talked about very practical things and things that related to my life. I began to understand the scriptures. I've never understood the scriptures at all. I've been to church all my life up to the time I was 15, and none of it made any sense to me. Suddenly it was practical. Suddenly it was amazing. I began to talk to God in a personal way. He began to answer prayers. And it would take me way too long to share with you the many answers to prayer that he gave me. But that was the beginning of a journey that started, like I said earlier, over 50 years ago. I would run out of time telling you how God brought me to a place of marriage, having 4 children who all serve the Lord in ministry with their spouses. It would take me too long to share with you all of the miracles, honestly, miracles that I've seen and experienced in my life. And real miracles. I've seen the blind see and the lame walk. I've seen amazing things done by the power of God. The reason for this entire video is to share with you just a few experiences of what it means to be a genuine Christian. I'm not a genuine Christian because I'm a good person. I'm a genuine Christian because I listen to the words that Jesus said in John's Gospel, chapter 3, verses 3 through 5. He said, "You must be born again." It means to be born from above. We come into a personal relationship with Jesus Christ simply by asking him to forgive us our sins, acknowledging that we're sinners, but then inviting him to come into our hearts. And you can do that anywhere. It doesn't have to be in a church service like what happened to me. You can do that in the privacy of your own home. But God wants to touch you because he genuinely loves you. And that's the message of everything that I share with people on a weekly basis. I'm a pastor of a church in Connecticut called Motion Church. You certainly don't have to come to that church to be a Christian, but you're welcome. But I share these things with you just so that you might experience what I have. And every Christian has had for hundreds, quite frankly, thousands of years. Thank you for taking the time to listen.